Why you don't care about climate change or water using science. Every few months, a new headline appears warning that artificial intelligence is consuming enormous amount of water. That reaction is predictable. People who have never cared about water infrastructure, irrigation, agriculture, drought policy, industrial food systems, animal agriculture, or the water footprint of their own diet suddenly become environmental absolutists the moment the subject is AI. The argument usually sounds like this: AI uses water. Water scarcity is bad. Therefore, AI is uniquely destructive, unethical, and environmentally unforgivable. There is a problem with that argument. It is not that AI uses no water. AI does use water. Data centers need cooling. Electricity generation often requires water. Semiconductor manufacturing has environmental costs. In some region, data centers can worsen already serious local water stress. That part is real. But if water is your moral standard, then you do not get to stop the argument at AI. You have to follow the evidence all the way down. And when you do, the evidence does not point first to ChatGPT. It points to agriculture, food systems, and meat heavy diets. It points to the choices people make every day while pretending their outrage is about the planet. Let's start with the concession that anti AI critics usually expect people to dodge. AI water use is real. Data centers consume water directly through cooling systems. They also consume water indirectly through the electricity required to run servers, networking equipment, and cooling infrastructure. A 2021 review in MPJ Clean Water estimated United States data center water consumption at about 1.7 billion liters per day, compared with 1,218 billion liters per day of U.S. total water consumption. Microsoft later summarized that order of magnitude as roughly 0.1% of national water use in the United States. 0.1%. That is not nothing, but it is also not the dominant water story in the economy. This is the first distinction people usually refuse to make. Something can be real and still not be the main driver. Something can be locally harmful and still not be the largest aggregate source of harm. Something can deserve regulation without being the center of the entire climate conversation. That is where AI water discourse often collapses. People take a real concern and inflate it into a totalitizing moral accusation. Recent research from the United Nations University argues that the total environmental footprint of AI infrastructure is rising quickly. Its 2026 report estimates that data centers' 2025 electricity consumption carried a water footprint of 4.5 trillion liters. The same report warns that by 2030, the associated footprint become large enough to equal the basic annual domestic water needs of 1.3 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa. That is serious. But the report also makes something else clear. AI's water footprint depends heavily on where electricity is generated and where compute infrastructure is located. Low carbon power is not automatically low water power. A data center powered by energy sources that require large amounts of water can carry a significant indirect water burden. That means that the actual ethical issue is not that AI simply exists. The issue is siting, disclosure, energy mixing, cooling design, water stress, corporate transparency, and public regulation. In other words, this is an infrastructure problem. It is not a magic argument against every use of AI. That's absolutism, which world-leading experts have warned about. The local issue is where anti-AI critics have their strongest case. A data center built in water-stressed area can be a problem. Even if data centers are small in national or global water totals, an individual facility can strain a local basin, especially in drought-prone regions. Ceres' 2025 analysis of Phoenix found that indirect water use from electricity can exceed direct on site cooling impacts. It projected that water associated with data center electricity in that region could rise 400%, while direct cooling water could rise 870%. In some already sustained basins, annual water stress increases could reach up to 17%. That same report found that two-thirds of new U.S. data centers built or in development since 2022 are in areas already experiencing high water stress, and that 32% of U.S. data centers are located in high or extremely high water stress areas. That is a valid concern. Communities should demand transparency. Data centers should not be allowed to quietly extract local resources while hiding behind vague sustainability language. Companies should disclose direct and indirect water use. Public officials should regulate where these facilities are built. Recycled water, closed loop cooling, dry cooling where appropriate, and siting rules should be a part of the conversation. But none of that proves that AI is the primary water issue. It proves that AI infrastructure needs oversight. That is a very different claim. Now comes the part that many AI critics avoid out of emotion. If your concern is water, agriculture dominates the conversation. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations reports that agriculture accounts for about 72% of global surface and groundwater withdrawals. A classic global footprint assessment found that agriculture production contributes about 92% of humanity's total water footprint. 92. In the United States, USDA researchers estimate that the food system accounts for about one third of national freshwater use. And as 2012 accounting, the U.S. food system used about 34 trillion gallons of water. Crop production made up about 63% of that total. The category beef, pork, and other meats accounted for 2.5 trillion gallons per year, while poultry accounted for 964 billion gallons per year. Read that again. The food system uses about one third of U.S. freshwater. Agriculture dominates global freshwater withdrawals. Agriculture production dominates humanity's total water footprint. Yet the average person's environmental outrage is not aimed at their plate, it is aimed at AI. Why? Because criticizing AI is easy, changing your diet is not, if you're other people. Criticizing AI lets people perform environmental concern without changing anything about their own consumption. They're doing worse than AI while citing AI as being is bad. Dietary consistency requires sacrifice, and that is where the moral performance gets exposed. The water footprint of meat, especially beef, is not a small issue. Mekonnen and Hoekstra's widely cited estimates put the global average total water footprint of beef at about 15,415 liters per kilogram. For comparison, beef uses about 15,415 liters per kilogram. A single beef based lunch uses around 37 bathtubs of water, way more than an independent query. Pig meat around 5,000, chicken meat around 4,000, and pulses around 4,000 liters per kilogram. Their analysis also found that per gram of protein, beef is about 6 times as water intensive as pulses. That matters because this is not some obscure industrial process hidden from ordinary people. This is food. This is daily consumption. This is one of the largest personal levers that people control. The same study looked specifically at U.S. diets and concluded that meat contributes 37% of food-related water footprint of the average American citizen. It estimated that replacing all meat with products such as pulses and nuts would reduce the average American's food-related water footprint by 30%. That is exactly the kind of evidence that makes selective anti-AI or outrage look unserious, because it largely is. Because if someone says AI water use is morally unacceptable while eating beef without concern, the issue is not really water, because they're contributing more water loss through their diet than someone typically using AI. The issue is preference, which is not ethics. They dislike AI, so they use water as the weapon. That's emotion based reasoning. But when the same standard touches their own habits, the urgency disappears. A common response is that not all water use is equal. That is true. Water from rainfall, groundwater, surface water, and polluted water are not the same thing. Water use in a wet region is not the same as water use in a drought stressed region. A simple liters used comparison can oversimplify the issue. But even when researchers use a stricter water scarcity lens, meat remains a major driver. A 2021 Nature food study of 16,000 U.S. Diets found that a five-fold variation in diet-related water scarcity footprints. Meat consumption contribute 31% of the average diet's water scarcity footprint. 31% versus less than a water bottle per prompt. Imagine that. You're doing way worse than AI. If you're worried about AI, then you should just switch your diet. It's that simple. And beef contributed about 6 times as much as chicken within that meat share. This means that the diet argument does not disappear when the analysis becomes more careful. It survives. The exact numbers shift depending on methodology, but the direction remains clear. Meat heavy diets, especially beef heavy diets, are a major water concern more than AI. There's also evidence that even modest dietary changes matter. A Tulane summary of U.S. diet research reported that swapping one serving of beef per day for chicken would reduce dietary water use impact by 30% on average, alongside a major carbon reduction. That is not even a vegan argument. That is simply the evidence showing that food choices materially affect water impact more so than AI. So when people act as if individual AI use is the obvious environmental sin when diet is irrelevant, they are not following the evidence. They are following social convenience, which is not sane. Water is not separate from climate change. Agriculture, land use, and energy systems and food systems are all a part of the same ecological crisis. This is why the anti AI water argument becomes so revealing. If someone only cares about water when discussing AI, they do not care about water as a principle. If someone only cares about emissions when discussing technology companies, they do not care about emissions as a principle. If someone only cares about environmental harm when the target is something they already dislike, they are not doing ethics. They are doing confirmation bias. Climate change does not care about your aesthetic preferences. Water scarcity does not care whether you find AI annoying. Ecological harm does not become real only when it comes from an industry you hate. A serious climate ethic has to be consistent. That means criticizing data centers when they worsen local water stress. It also means criticizing animal agriculture when it consumes massive amounts of water, land, crops, and energy that you don't have to support. It means looking at the full system instead of cherry picking the villain that costs you the least to condemn. But AI is unnecessary. Another common response is that AI is unnecessary while food is necessary. That sounds stronger than it is, but is not true. Food is necessary. A beet heavy diet is not. A meat diet is not necessary. Animal agriculture at its current industrial scale is not. Luxury consumption patterns are not. Meat is a luxury. High water foods in water stressed regions are not. The choice is not AI versus food. The choice is between honest systems analysis and selective outrage. A person can reasonably argue that some AI uses are wasteful. Many are. A person can reasonably argue that data centers should be regulated. They should. A person can reasonably argue that communities should have control over local water sources. They should. But once the argument becomes AI uses water, therefore AI is uniquely unethical, the standard has to apply elsewhere. If it does not apply to diet, it was never a standard. If it was a preference disguised as a principle, it was a preference disguised as a principle. A principle applies consistently. A preference applies selectively. If you oppose AI because of water use but ignore agriculture, that is not a principle. If you condemn data centers for local water stress but ignore beef production, that is not a principle. If you demand sacrifice from disabled people, students, poor people, workers, and independent creators who use AI to function, learn, write, communicate, or survive, while demanding no sacrifice from your own diet, that is not a principle. That is convenience. That is that is emotion. That is selective moral accounting, and that is not sane. And that is the problem with much of the anti AI climate discourse. It is not that every concern is false, some concerns are true. The problem is that the concern is applied asymmetrically, one way. AI is treated as unforgivable, diet is treated as personal choice. Technology, even though AI is a personal choice, technology is treated as moral contamination. Food habits are treated as private preference such as AI. That is not environmental ethics. That is hypocrisy with citations. What a consistent position looks like. A consistent position would sound like this: AI water use is real and should be regulated. Data centers should disclose direct and indirect water use. Facilities should not be built recklessly in water stressed regions. Companies should use recycled water where possible. Energy sourcing should account for all water as well as carbon. Local communities should have oversight. And if water matters, diet matters too. Beef heavy and meat heavy diets deserve scrutiny. Agriculture water use deserves scrutiny. Animal agriculture deserves scrutiny. Some would say even more, since animal agriculture wastes more water than AI. Personal consumption deserves scrutiny, such as your diet. That is a consistent position, not Ignore AI, not AI is harmless, not diet is the only thing that matters. The consistent position is that water ethics must apply everywhere, especially where the evidence says the largest impacts are. And the evidence overwhelmingly shows that food and agriculture are central to water use. The real reason this makes people angry. The argument makes people angry because it moves the target. It takes water concern away from the abstract villain and brings it back to daily behavior. It asks whether the person condemning AI is willing to apply the same standard to themselves. That is why people resist it, not because the evidence is weak, but because the implication is personal, such as using AI is a personal choice. It is easy to say a data center should change. It is harder to say your diet should change. It is easy to demand sacrifice from technology users. It is harder to accept sacrifice in your own life. It is easy to condemn an industry you already hate. It is harder to examine an industry you participate in every day. But that is what consistency requires. Logic. If water actually matters, then prove it. AI water use is real. Data center expansion deserves scrutiny. Local water stress deserves serious regulation. Corporate greenwashing deserves criticism. But if you only care about water when the subject is AI, then you do not care about water. You care about having a socially acceptable reason to hate AI. You are a conformist, which is not sane. The evidence does not support treating AI as the primary water problem while ignoring agriculture. The evidence does not support obsessing over chatbots while dismissing meat heavy diets. The evidence does not support using water as a moral weapon only when the target is technology. If water matters, agriculture matters. If climate change matters, diet matters. If environmental ethics matters, consistency matters. You can criticize AI infrastructure and still admit that food systems are a bigger water story. You can demand transparency from data centers and still admit that beef is one of the most water intensive foods people commonly consume. If you can care about technological harms and still accept responsibility for personal consumption. But you do not get to call yourself serious about water while ignoring the largest water consuming systems on Earth. That is not climate concern. That is not environmental ethics. That is outrage. And selective outrage will not save the planet. It will only save your emotions. Sources in the link Sources in the description below. If you have any questions, I'm free to ask, although you probably will dismiss this without even investigation. Condemnation without investigation is the highest form of ignorance and narcissism, such as the average person.